Hello and welcome to another edition of James and Chris Science videos, where today we're continuing our series of lessons looking at classifying living organisms. In the previous lesson we looked at the 5 different kingdoms that you need to know for the ISEB and Key Stage 3 syllabus, they being animal, plant, fungi, bacteria and protists or protozoa. So we looked at that in the last lesson that we ran. In today's lesson we're going to focus on the animal kingdom and how we can then split that into different categories. On the screen in front of you is a list of the layers of categories that we split them. So we start for living organisms at kingdoms. So we split them into those kingdoms. We've got the animal kingdom, which is what we're going to focus today. That will then split into phylums and subphylums, and we're going to focus on that. So how do I split animals into 2 groups? The answer to that question is we use this. We use the backbone. We use a spine. Now, the little bones inside the spine are called vertebrae. And this word for those bones gives rise to the name that we use for the 2 separate subphylum that we use. And that word is either vertebrae, or if I put a prefix of in front of it, it would be invertebrate. Now, I've shown here that what that word prefix in means, because in science that's quite often used. The 3 examples I've got is invisible, so the in front of it means not, so not visible. Insane means you're not sane. I could have said inflexible, couldn't I? You're not flexible. Insecure, meaning not secure. So in our terms, invertebrate means not having a spine. And there are a whole load of different animals that we can categorize into that, and that's the purpose of this lesson. Let's focus then on invertebrates and see what we've got. So we've got the animal kingdom here, and I've split them into vertebrates and invertebrates. I'm going to ignore the vertebrates for today's lesson. That is going to come into another lesson, so we'll do a specific lesson on vertebrates a little bit later in the week. We'll look at invertebrates, and that is split into, well, I've split into 6. There are more, but for our purposes, 6 is enough to start looking at. And those 6 are annelids, arthropods, cnidarians, silent C, echinoderms, molluscs and sponges. And I'm going to do a little picture for each one just to show you a quick example. Now, annelids you'll recognise as worms. I'm going to give some more details about each of these categories in a minute, so it's just an introduction. So my worms are annelids. Arthropods literally means jointed legs. Arthro for joints, you might have heard of people with arthritis. That is where the joints swell. And pods, that word pod comes from the Latin of feet. So, centipedes, that's the same origin of the word. Cnidarians, there we go. They're jellyfish. And, well, again, we'll see some examples of those in a minute. Echinoderms are my starfish. Molluscs are things like snails. We'll come to them in a second. And sponges, which we think were the first ever animals to exist. Now, time for you to do some setting up. So, very similar to what we did for the animal kingdoms, I'd like you to either get a piece of paper or to use the OneNote that I've sent you, and again split it into 6 different areas, like this. On each different section, could you put the title of annelids, arthropods, cnidarians, echinoderms, molluscs and sponges? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of those different groups, and I'd like you to write down some facts for each of those. So for annelids, we're going to talk about how I can tell it's an annelid and some of the key kind of features. I've given an example for each of those, and you'll see when I go through the slides what they are. I'd like you, and this should be quite fun, I'd like you to look up and find an interesting example of each of those different phylum that is different to the one that I've showed you. And I want you to find interesting, amazing and obscure examples. Don't go for the simple, go for the weird and wonderful. And I want you to put a picture of that into each box with a little name and just a sentence about the animal of why it's so unique. I would suggest you pause the video here at this point and you set up that sheet so that you're ready to go for the rest of the video. So I'm going to count down to 3 before I go on to the next slide to give you time to pause it. 3, 2, 1. Let's start with annelids. Annelids, as I said before, are a type of worm. And there are other types of worms. I've just focused on annelids because that's probably the worms that you're most familiar with. These types of worms have segmented bodies. That means that each of their bodies are in segments, and you can see the rings that go around them that divide each of the segments. Funnily enough, most live in the oceans. The ones that we're used to are the earthworms that live underground. But there's a whole host of annelids that live in the sea, and they might be worth researching. The example I've given is, well, Australia have to do everything much bigger and more poisonous, more dangerous than us, don't they? But Australia have a species, a variety, called the giant earthworm. And there was a big problem a couple of years ago where there were some floods and people were finding hundreds of these in their garden, which would be quite a scary thought to wake up to. But there's a picture of a giant Australian earthworm. Arthropods. These we're going to do a complete lesson on because arthropods is a key section of the curriculum. So we're going to look at arthropods in a lot more detail in a future lesson. But for the moment, I've put on just some key facts. And the key facts of arthropods is that they have jointed legs. So you can see on their legs the joints. And the picture, I've got a camel spider on below. But you can see on their legs, the joints are visible from the outside. That's where they get their name from. They have a hard exoskeleton. It's made out of a chemical called chitin. But that hard exoskeleton goes around the outside. We've got something called an endoskeleton. That means endo being inside, exo being outside. So the exoskeleton being tough and hard on the outside. Imagine, if you will, that if you bit a camel spider, not that I'd recommend it, you'd get a crunch and then all the goo would be in the inside. Yum. Cnidarians, these jellyfish live in the sea. They have to be in the sea because they have no structure to support their shape. So if you take onto land, they just look like puddles. You might have seen them on the beach. When you go to the beach, you see these kind of like weird jelly puddles. They can support themselves in water, so you tend to find them in water, oceans particularly. They're soft-bodied. Most of them are transparent. You can see the body parts inside. And they're predators. They hunt things. The tentacles below have sting cells that will paralyze fish, and then they eat the fish. The example I've given there is the Portuguese man-of-war. It's not the most deadliest. It's the second most deadliest jellyfish. I thought it'd be fun to leave you the most deadliest if you wanted to look that up. This one can kill humans. If you touch it and you have an allergic reaction to the sting, it can kill you. The tentacles at the bottom can reach up to 3 or 4 meters. There was a spate of about 100 of these were washed up in beaches in Cornwall in 2012, and that to shut the beaches in Cornwall. Such were the stings that we're getting. So my example here is a Portuguese man-of-war. Onto the echinoderms. These you'll know as starfish, but they also represent some other interesting organisms, which again, when you're researching them, you might be able to find and put in. They live in oceans. They are categorized by the fact they've got hundreds of tiny feet with suction cups at the bottom. And they go around, they've actually got a mouth in the middle. They go around eating things. They're predators. So they'll go over something like some barnacles and their mouth parts will open and they'll start eating the barnacle. The example I've given you, just because I love the colour of it, it's a blue sea star. No guesses why it's called a blue sea star. And there's an example of it, and they're really vivid in colour. And when you look at different coral reefs, the blue sea stars always stand out for me as being, really quite striking organisms. Molluscs are, well, we know them as shells and slugs, but they also live a lot in the sea. They're categorised again by a soft body, but this time almost all have shells. The glaring example, there's a couple of glaring examples actually. The snails have a shell, but slugs don't. And then octopuses are actually molluscs, and they don't have a shell. Most of them, like I say, will have shell. Most will also have 1 foot. That sticks in. Again, not all. Octopuses being a great example of something that doesn't have 1 foot. The example I've given to you here is a clam, mainly because I like eating them. But a clam and the shellfish and seafood that you get are molluscs. The last type that I want to show you is a sponge. This particular type of sponge is a stovepipe sponge, and it's called that because a stovepipe, it used to be in the olden days when you used to have your cooker and you used to put your wood in your cooker, and there used to be a pipe that come out. And the early discoverers back in the 18th, 19th century, it reminded them of their cooker pipes. Some of you got Argas, they've got stovepipes that come out of them if you've got an Arga in your home. They're categorised by, again, they live in oceans. They have to live in an ocean because of how they feed. They cannot move from place to place. They stay in one place the whole time. After their reproductive cycle, they produce spores that go around and settle. And when they settle, they then grow and they'll stay in that area there. They are filter feeders, which means they have little fans that come out and they collect any floating debris, any phytoplankton, any zooplankton, any kind of microscopic organisms get caught in the filter, and they bring that in and they digest what's there. You should have a lot of fun with sponges. There is a whole variety of different colours, shapes. So researching sponges, hopefully you will find, again, quite interesting. It's fascinating. Now, I'm going to quickly do a summary, and what I suggest is wait to the end of the summary. I'll quickly go through the topic and then go off and finish that sheet that I've kind of asked you to do, and to fill in your research for that. And if you're in my lessons, you can hand it in. If not, then it just makes a nice wall display, I suppose. So here is my summary. We can split the animal kingdom into two according to whether the animal contains backbone or not. That is our way of splitting them. The two groups of that animal kingdom are vertebrates and invertebrates. That in meaning no backbone. Invertebrates, no backbone. The phylum for invertebrates are annelids, arthropods, cnidarians, echinoderms, molluscs and sponges. There are others, but those are the ones I've chosen to focus on today. Living organisms, I've also put a fantastic diversity in one. I hope, if nothing else, through the research you do as part of this lesson, that you can see how wonderful some of the different diversity of life is and how weird and wonderful living things are, particularly in the sea. I love some of the sea organisms, so hopefully you enjoy doing that. Thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.